Hello and welcome to IEEE Soft Robotics podcast. In this podcast, we're going to interview researchers from both academia and industry about their work, thoughts, spectrum, and more beyond that. This is Marwa Edwini, and I hope you will find this podcast useful. If you would like to connect with us, simply send us, and we will be happy to hear from you. And here is my interview. Thanks.
Hello and welcome to IEEE Soft Robotics podcast. Hello, Professor Taylor. Thanks so much for joining us in the podcast. Yeah, I would like to ask you how you would like to define yourself for the audience who may be first time listening to you.
Probably define myself as a research engineer. What I'm most interested in doing is solving problems in the world. I view robotics as coupling information to action in the physical world.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at that, to do useful things, and a lot of what I do involves really a three-way partnership between people and technology, the robots and the imagers and all, and information to change processes.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that we don't know how to do in order to implement a system that does something. And so that's the research. But generally, for me, it's research related in some way or another to a practical need. It might be still curiosity driven. I wonder if I could get a machine to do something.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, it's, gee, if I could get a machine to do something, then I think I could use it for this, that, or the other thing.
So I think you really brought interesting point about how science should looks like. Do you think now, comparison maybe when you start working in 1980s, for example, there's a difference between the objective or maybe the motivation? Is it about curiosity or it's more about securing funding and publication? Because we ask all the time if we have riskier idea, sometimes it's just yeah, you can't get funding and you can't secure publication out of these risky ideas. So how do you see maybe I don't know battle between risky idea and incremental ideas, for example?
Okay, well, that's actually very interesting. Well, first you mentioned curiosity, and again, curiosity versus demand pull, and as I mentioned, that really is sort of an interaction. Uh, in academia, well, actually, in the world, it's not enough simply to have a really interesting idea. You also need to find the resources somewhere to pursue that idea.
Mm.
And that actually is a challenge in industry too, although perhaps in a little different way. In industry, you usually need to tie what you want to do a little more strongly to potential product or profit for your company. But in academia, I think it's also true. During well, I had 19 years at IBM Research, and then over 20 years, actually going on 25 years here at Johns Hopkins. There's similarities. I do think that academic careers, especially junior faculty, have to be very concerned about uh, uh, establishing a track record that will get them promoted and get them tenure. And in my experience, the people who are very successful academics don't let that drive them, uh, because if you try to punch tickets simply, you will only do derivative research. And yeah, I wish I had a better answer. I generally advise
Mm-hmm.
junior faculty here to understand what it is you want to do, and then let's see if we can figure out a way to get the funds or the resources to do it.
Mm-hmm. That's
And sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. I mean, even senior faculty, when we write grant reviews, we'll get reviews back, and sometimes they say, yes, this is great, we think this should be funded, and everyone goes out and celebrates. Sometimes you have criticisms, and you either look at those and say, "Yeah, that's right. Here's how I'll fix it," or "Boy, that person just didn't understand what I was trying to say." And that's things that are hardest because very often it has been the case that you just haven't explained clearly enough what it is you want to do and why it's important.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes simply the reviewer is just flat out wrong. But
Yeah, yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
that's life.
Yeah. So I'm guess this case since in 80s you have been working at IBM, so in surgical robotics. So if you can tell us about what could be the most important question still not answered yet in terms of surgical robotics, the
Oh,
most important questions.
the most important question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that you can say there is the most important question. I think is one of the most important questions in surgical robotics is probably how can the computer maintain a situational awareness in a procedure and safely assist the surgeon in doing the procedure.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a great deal of interest out there now in aspects of autonomy, the machine doing more and more to help you. And we often see rather complicated tiers of autonomy. In fact, I've been co author on guest editorials and so forth that talk about that. But I think in the end, it really boils down to two questions.
Mm-hmm.
How can you tell the machine what the machine is supposed to do in a way that the machine can understand it? And then how can you be sure the machine will do what you want it to do and not something else?
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you look at all of these tiers of autonomy that you see published, in the end, they really come down to those two questions in various levels.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the way I see this evolving personally is fairly incrementally, at least in surgery, where the computers are already able to do the robots to do certain tasks more or less under computer control. In fact, teleoperation secretly has a lot of computer control in it already. And so I think the question really then boils down to how do you specify more complicated tasks, and how can the computer get the information to maintain the situational awareness, the model of the patient and the state and so forth, to do the control to help the surgeon, and can you do all of that in a way the surgeon can trust it?
Mm-hmm.
Um, the first surgical robot to do really dramatic surgery was the system that I developed with Peter Kazantzidis when we were at IBM Research, at least the prototype that was then commercialized by a company that was called Integrated Surgical Systems and is now called Think Robotics, for doing hip replacement surgery, where the specification of the task was simply to say, here is where you need to make the hole in a bone to place an orthopedic implant. And that could be done from CT images, whether say for knee surgery or hip surgery, very, very clearly. And then what you had to do in the operating room was simply fix the knee and find the bone accurately enough so the robot could machine the shape accurately. And so that usually is considered autonomous. Uh, when you get to much more interactive surgery, such as these Da Vinci systems for minimally invasive surgery, um, things get much more complicated in terms of the task. And we're still primarily relying on the surgeon's situational awareness and the the what the robot is supposed to do is determined by motion of control handles. Um, that is beginning to evolve, especially where you have robots with three or four hands, and maybe one of them can help with things like retraction. And on a research basis, people are very interested in doing things like automating suturing. But I really see this
Mm,
as an evolution. And to get each step in the evolution, I think the machine has to do something better than a human. There has to be a real advantage. It could be time saving, it could be safety, it could be greater accuracy. It's got to be something.
mhm, mhm.
That's a
That
long
makes sense.
answer. I apologize.
No, it's an excellent answer, but I'm guess if we can break it down to the situational awareness, for example, do you think it may be challenging in terms of sensing, for example, how we design reliable sensor? Where you imagine could be that could be solved to make it a situational awareness tool?
Okay, I think sensing is part of it.
Mm,
Vision sensing and the whole processing of information coming from vision sensors is clearly a key part. Sensing of direct sensing of tool to tissue forces and other information that humans just don't have access to, radiological sensing and so forth. That's part of it. But I think maybe the more crucial part is the fusion of information, so that you have all of this sensor information, and we already have a lot of it. How do I combine all of that information to make some kind of a computer representation of what's going on in the patient and the task that the computer can then use in real time to help the surgeon?
mm,
And so I think, personally, I think that's the key issue. Uh, Now, how you help the surgeon, it could be by generating some display, some augmented reality overlay. It could be helping with the control of the robot. But I think in the end, the situational awareness that the computer has should complement, as we said,
mm.
that of the surgeon.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. May I ask you what could be still maybe so challenging in terms of when it comes to strategic robotics beyond situational awareness? What could be most challenging aspects you still facing, in designing this surgical robot?
Okay, again, we're focusing on surgical robots. I should just mention, I think there are other areas, even in medical robotics, that are also very important. But
Mm,
within surgical robotics, I think reliability, certifiability, and patient safety obviously have to be paramount. And I think some of this is a processes. If you're going to develop a surgical robot that's going to be used on a person, you really need to go through a very rigorous process so that you can be sure that those two questions that I raised are answered very strongly, that you can guarantee patient safety.
mhm,
There are other issues, again, having to do with just putting a robot in the operating room, sterility, materials, and things like that. Surgical robots, fundamentally, you're dealing with safety issues, and there is a very strong systems engineering challenge uh, that you would have with any safety critical system, that is an additional challenge to the kind of technological challenges of modeling and device development and sensing and all of these other things.
mhm, mhm. That's a good point. But maybe we can just ask about the safety aspect when it
Okay.
comes to designing the operator or the tool. How do you think about integration software robotic in that case? We see that origami structure sometimes could be used, for example. So how do you see the mechanical intelligence when it comes to the surgical tools we use in operation? How do you see the safety aspect here if we speak about soft tools?
Of using soft tools as compared to, I think the issues are the same.
Mm-hmm,
Um, I think you have to look very much at specifics. It's very difficult to make a general assertion. If I'm using some sort of inflatable or soft robot grasper for tissue retraction, maybe that will be gentler on tissue I'm trying to retract. On the other hand, it's also got to be able to be firm enough to pull the tissue out of the way.
Hmm.
Uh, I, so I think it's very difficult to make a general conclusion. I do think that some of these soft actuators, soft systems are very exciting and very interesting, and do have a lot of possibilities. I don't think they're a panacea. Uh, I think they're one more tool in a toolkit, just like continuum robots are a tool in the toolkit that can be used in these kind of procedures.
So I'm curious to ask you about the cochlear implant surgery because we know sometimes you can't use, like, for example, MRI techniques in that case during the surgery. And there's maybe tried now to use AIB since a couple of years ago, and still we don't have. Yeah, I don't know how to see the progress of using active material as actuator and the sensor to place these electrodes correctly, since sometimes the surgeon doesn't have the sense to know whether they place these electrodes correctly or not in human cochlea.
Well, well, it's again really hard to generalize without looking at a specific system, a specific paper. Uh, as a general proposition, I think active materials in microsurgical applications are a very exciting possibility, both because there is a possibility of combining actuation with sensing in interesting ways,
Mm,
and because you often can have an advantage in having things in very small scales. Uh, it is still very important, I think, to look at the control bandwidth that you can get with these systems because that can also be important.
mm,
And again, there is all finally there is a trade-off which can be exploited between natural compliance and active compliance. And generally, if a natural compliance lets you do things, that makes the rest of the system simpler. But not always if it gets in the way of some precision of control that you might need for something else. I am sorry that sounds like a bit of an evasive answer. I don't mean it to be that way, but I'm not sure that you can really make a definitive statement,
mm.
except perhaps in looking at a very specific example. And I'm not sure that that's more of the kind of thing we do when we're reviewing papers.
I agree with you. Yeah. So maybe a question here about what could be still unavoidable trade-off for designing when you design the surgical robotic, for example, or the tools, for example. What could be unavoidable trade-off? Something you have to give up on.
Ooh, you can't have your cake and eat it. Okay. I think one trade-off is strength versus size versus scale. That is clearly an important trade-off. Another is bandwidth versus all of these things and sensitivity. Um, it is still, I think, one of the most exciting areas of advances are we're able to fabricate smaller and smaller sensors and integrate them into smaller and smaller structures, whether active or passive. But there's still a trade-off. I mean, we're we're not quite always at the point of fighting physics, but we're sometimes getting very close to that. And so you're going to have trade-offs. Um, I might want, say, very, very delicate tweezers that are able to sense forces I'm exerting at the sub-millinewton range, but I still might want to be able to exert tens of newtons of force with those for some reason. Well, I'm exaggerating, but there's still there's only so much you can do within the limits of technology. Uh,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think there are also, as a practical matter, cost limits that we also, certainly academics, we have limited budgets, but using these systems, deploying them for clinical care, you do have to worry about the cost of the systems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So maybe also maybe I'm curious to ask you: have you ever designed something in modeling, for example? Because you mentioned modeling is so challenging when it comes to patient and also the tool. And when you deployed in real experiment with really counterintuitive or surprising result, you didn't expect that when you try to model or think about the expected result. Have you ever had something like that, unexpected
Oh,
result?
sure, of course. I mean, I can give you a simple example now. We are working on force sensing tweezers, among other things. And we made an initial design that the finite element analysis looked like it would work really well. But when we then fabricated it, and the first set of experiments showed a great deal of crosstalk between the forces we were wanting to measure and those that we were not measuring. And that now has forced us to go back and reconsider our design concept. So that's a simple example. Um, I think by the time you get to um, kind of a complete system, things often do go more or less the way you expected. Certainly, the Robodoc, that first hip replacement system, we did a lot of work initially getting the system to work right, and both in modeling and programming, and then the doing, and it did what it was designed to do. I mean, always when you deploy a system
Mm-hmm.
in practice, there are lots of things that you only that you forgot about, that you find out about, practicalities of this, that, or the other thing. And so over time, more this was more done in the company that commercialized that system.
Mm-hmm.
Their design evolved as they got more experience, and they were able to operate faster, and they found out different ways of holding a bone and finding the bone and things like that. So, but that's sort of normal. Um, uh, where it's a normal part of engineering development.
Yeah.
One of the other projects, a non-surgical project that we're working on right now, is a robotic system to extract salivary glands from mosquitoes. This is We're working in partnership with a company in Rockville, Maryland, that has a clinically effective malaria vaccine. But our goal is to help them increase the production rate and consistency of production of getting the salivary glands out of the mosquitoes. And It's a very sophisticated system we're developing that has computer vision, robots, standard automation equipment. And these mosquitoes are really tricky to work with. And so, just as in any system, you we put it together. We get good experience. You see things that aren't quite what you expected to see, and I can't get into the details right now because of patent reasons. But you see things that 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 you weren't expecting to see, and then you scratch your head a little bit, and you modify your design, or you tweak a parameter, and that's just normal in any engineering development. I don't think surgical robots are any different.
Mm-hmm.
It does take. I think sometimes the students get a little bit disappointed in that things don't work perfectly the first time out of the box, but that's again part of learning.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe a question here related about when you um, have this reproducible performance or reliability in the robots as well. So why it's so challenging to transform robots from lab to commercial application? You had this experience. Why it's so challenging when we try to transform what we do in the lab to real world application? Because we want to make sure it's reproducible or reliable. So why it's so challenging, do you think?
Why is it challenging?
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about what makes it challenging and then talk about why those things are there.
Mhm.
One of the things that makes things challenging is usually when you're going to deploy a commercial system, you worry more about cost than you do in a prototype. And you worry much more about manufacturing processes, among other things, and also materials and so forth. A second issue is usually customers expect the thing that they bought to continue to work for a while and be very reliable. And reliability, if your focus is on getting something to see if it'll work at all, is often a secondary consideration. It helps if when you're thinking about it, you at least think about how eventually it would be reliable. Um, I think for surgical things, the development process as well, there's a lot more testing required. And also, your design process needs to be documented much better. So I think from a we talk bench to bedside time. A lot of what you're doing at the beginning is you're trying to see, can you make something work at all? Can in a way that at least potentially you think it has an advantage, and then you have to prove it. Now, for medical products especially, there is very stringent regulation over the entire development process, and a great deal more testing is expected, and documentation than most graduate students are used to. At our lab, occasionally we've tried to incorporate more of that kind of work into all of our systems development, but it's still a different order of magnitude than what you see in medical device development.
Mhm.
Being aware of some of those things can help you shorten the process. But there really is a trade-off between quickly understanding what the problem is and understanding whether your engineering idea will address that problem
Mhm.
and addressing these other things.
Yeah, I really like this part because when you figure out what could be the real problem and what kind of problems you create and you try to solve. If a student asks you how I can figure out the most important problems, maybe in a way, because sometimes we do mistakes sometimes. So what could be the hint you can figure out this is the most important problem, or maybe the problem you have to create or you have to figure out and find a solution for it?
Well, usually what we do, and again, I'm talking surgical systems,
Mm,
or is talk to the people who have the problems, work closely with physicians
mm-hmm,
who will usually tell you what their problems are, but then you have to continually stay in contact.
mm-hmm,
Um, One of the biggest mistake that I think some medical robotics people, and I fear some companies occasionally make, is they'll interview a few surgeons, say, "Hot dog, here's our problem." Go off and come back a year or two later and say, "Here's our answer," and the surgeon would look at it and say, "Yeah, but no, that's not what my real problem is." So I think the best thing to do is make it a continual process. Generally, our our research here at Johns Hopkins, is there are weekly or at least every other week meetings with our clinical end users, as just part of the routine thing we do.
Hmm.
And one of the tricks, I think, is to find a, a way of engaging your user community and keeping them engaged while you're solving some of these engineering problems.
Hmm.
And that's probably the easiest answer I can make. I do think that it's also very, very important uh,
Hmm.
to answer. They're often referred to as the Heilmeier questions, although at IBM Research, our director of research had a slightly similar version. But first question, what do you want to do? Second question is, why do you want to do that? What if you are, and a third question is, how will you measure success? How will you know when you've succeeded? So, what do you want to do? Why is what you want to do solving some real problem in the world or potentially enabling a real problem to be solved? And then how are you going to measure success? And so I think in all of our discussions with our graduate students, with ourselves, we do try to keep those questions in mind from the beginning and always there. So that's sort of general engineering advice. It certainly
Hmm.
doesn't only apply to surgical robots or medical robots or robots in general. I think that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying that. So we are closing to end and have a few questions. The first one about redundancy. You highlight about the safety concern about the tool. How you make sure the surgical tool is redundant during operation if a failure happened, for example, scenario like that, to make sure safety for the patient. How we make
Okay,
sure this time?
that's well, that's a very, very good question. And anything we want to use in a clinical trial, we have to worry about that. Um, there is a standard process called FMEA, Failure Modes and Effects Analysis,
Mm-hmm.
that anything that we think is heading toward a clinical study, we'll try to do that ourselves. And obviously, any company commercializing what we do does it even more, where you actually say, well, what could fail in this system? How likely is it that it could fail? How likely is it that we would know that it fails? And what would the effect of the failure be? And what would we do about it?
Mm-hmm.
And one of I think there one of the uses of redundancy is it helps you answer most of those questions. If I have a feedback encoder on a robot joint and that fails, the joint could go out of control.
Mm-hmm.
So what the standard answer is, well, I need two ways of measuring this motion, and if they don't agree, then I know something is wrong and I need to correct. Usually in surgical robots, that's done by having two encoders. There are other ways of doing it. One would be a standard feedback encoder and some way of directly measuring, say, the tool to tissue relationship. But I think I think that's what we have to do, and redundancy is absolutely crucial. And again, I'll go back to that very first surgical robot that we developed. I actually um, what for the experimental prototype, what we did is we had a conventional robot that didn't have in it for the prototype uh, have it had one set of encoders. So I used an optical tracking system that was accurate to a tenth of a millimeter to watch what the end effector did, and those had to agree. And I also knew where the tool there was some region that tool was allowed to be in, and if it got out of that region, the optical tracker would say, "Whoa, stop, freeze the robot because you're not doing the right thing." And there were two things interesting there. The company for the product really went to multiple encoders in the arm, which is maybe a better engineering solution. But the other thing is that extra redundancy was enormously helpful in debugging the system, identifying other things that we didn't expect beyond just simply is the robot in control. So it actually helps you to build more redundancy into the system than you even need for the FMEA because it helps you troubleshoot. Uh, for the the mosquito dissection example,
Mm.
we've actually got multiple video cameras all over the system. I don't know if we're going to if you use them all in a production system, but they sure do help us figure out how to debug the system. So good in mostly I'm talking about good engineering rather than medical robots. But good engineering, among other things, means that you should pay a lot of attention to how do you instrument a system while you're building it so that you can understand the things that your modeling predicted but isn't quite what reality is.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I think it's also an instruction for Sida as well to consider what he's saying. So thank you for saying that. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. What is your maybe favorite robot in this journey? The favorite robot you build?
Oh lordy, it's usually the one I'm working on now. Uh, uh, Probably the robots that I'm most interested in. I really like them all, so it's a little unfair question. It's like asking who's your favorite child. But a
Yeah.
lot of the robots that I've been interested in for many, many, many years have been hand over hand systems where the robot and the surgeon both hold the surgical tool. If I pull on the tool, the robot feels that and just follows my hand.
Hmm.
But by golly, it's a robot. It doesn't have hand tremor. And if you're working in microsurgery, that's very, very important. Because especially if I have a long tool, a little bit of hand tremor makes the end uh, move in ways that I can't do the microsurgery I want to do. But also because it's robot, it can do things like enforce safety barriers. It can take over and say using some other sensor do some local thing on its own. One example is if I want to say insert a needle into a blood vessel without going out the other side,
Hmm.
I can sense when I've gotten into the vessel and just stop. If I am machining bone in the skull base, there are two nerves. There's the facial nerve and a nerve called the chorda tympani, and I have to get to the cochlea. I have to make a space right in here. And by the way, if I damage either of those, it's really terrible. I only got a millimeter or so. But if the robot knows where those delicate structures are, it can just stop me from driving into it.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then you look at RoboDoc, once the robot knew what it had to do, it could machine the hole much more accurately than a human did. In fact, in that case, we hand guided the robot to get it about in position. We then did a registration, and then the robot did the rest of it autonomously. In that case, the safety critical aspect, aside from the robot not going crazy, really is the registration. Does the robot know where to make the hole? And the biggest risk there was you get the registration wrong.
Hmm.
Uh, um, so again, there's this kind of trade-off in partnership, just like if you have a partner doing carpentry or something. I mean, some cases one will help, you'll do some hand guiding and steadying. In other cases, maybe the system or the helper will do something on its own.
Hmm.
So
Absolutely.
it's that interaction that is probably my most favorite aspect of this
Interesting.
kind of robots.
Interesting. Yeah. So, do you think ego is important for you? Ego is important for you.
Ego. Oh, a very egotistical person would say no. It's, I think, with anybody, you get a certain satisfaction out
Mm.
of, yeah, hey, I did that. But, or hey, I'm a fellow of various societies, or I'm a member of the National Academy. Yeah, of course, that is very gratifying. But I honestly believe that for me, the real payoff is seeing things I've done get into use.
Mm.
and seeing things that either I or even more important, our students have done, have discovered something or have figured out how to solve a critical problem. It's the discovery and demonstration, I think, of solving important problems in the world that really drives me. And it's always fun to solve the problems you have to solve along the way. So
Mm,
I actually think that is more a driver for me than the ego aspects of recognition or those
mm-hmm.
kind of things.
Wonderful.
And
Yeah.
generally, I've noticed that most people who are successful, that is the case. You also, I mean, we work with surgeons who have big egos. They have to have the confidence to do what they do. So you quickly learn to deal with that. I used to joke that a standard way of measuring, a standard unit for measuring ego is the microsurgeon. But I, it, and you need a certain level of confidence to pursue something, but I think you also do need a measure of humility. And as you get further along in your career, more and more successful people really find their rewards in the success of people they've mentored. And I think that is true for most of us who are fairly senior, and certainly in our field, at least most of the folks I know.
Yeah. I have respect for that. Thank you. And may I ask you what is the most important quality you have gained in this journey and you have to maintain? The most important quality you have gained. Most important
Probably I've
quality.
learned that I have to be more patient than I was at the beginning, both patient
Mm,
with others and also just simply patient with problems.
mm,
I still am a very impatient person, more impatient than I should, but I think probably the most important quality that I think I've gained over my career is some greater ability to take a longer view of things.
mm.
I can't claim that I'm always successful at that, but I think that is probably something, again, it probably comes with the territory of being a senior academic or a senior person in industry is
Yeah. Thanks for sharing this. Yeah, with us. Yeah. And lastly, what was the best advice it was given to you and was the life changing?
advice. I'm not sure I could point to a particular piece of. I tell you what probably the most career changing
Okay.
interaction I had
Sure.
actually was when I was an undergraduate at Johns Hopkins. I had an opportunity to work for a professor who became my undergraduate mentor. This was Mendel Belmore, and I was implementing Fortran programs, mathematical programming optimization programs, from among other things for something called the traveling salesman's
Yeah.
problem that he and his graduate student John Malone had developed algorithms for. And I think that experience of research, mentored research, really did help shape my career. It certainly pointed me at Stanford, where I went to grad school, and Professor Belmore clearly wrote, uh, uh, I think, the letter that probably got me accepted there. And I mean, as a result, I've tried to do the same thing for others. I recognize that undergraduates are often just starting out, and if you can get them involved, it changed my life to be involved with research early on, and I think that um, it's important to us, especially in academia, to create those opportunities for students at all levels. Uh,
Mm,
so that for me was, and it's interesting that after I came back to Johns Hopkins, Professor Belmore had already left. He had a very, very then successful career consulting, but we got back in touch and are now personal friends, and so that's rewarding too.
Wow, that's wonderful. Yeah, yeah. Do you have any final words you'd like to share for robotics community? Any final words you would like to say?
Final words. One is I envy you. Uh, I think we are finally ideas, many of which were there 40 years ago or more when we were just starting, are now becoming practical.
Yeah,
And the community is growing, and robotic systems are playing more and more crucial role in our society and will over the next 20 years. And so I really envy people getting into this field now because the infrastructure is there to do amazing things. And I think, especially with this three-way partnership between people and technology and information, to do things in the world that can transform our society for the better and help us solve some of the enormous problems that our societies around the world face. So I envy you. I'm hoping to stick around long enough to enjoy some of it, but
yeah,
that's probably my parting words. Good
yeah.
luck, and I envy you.
Yeah, but I think you have a really rich experience, and I think what you said is very inspiring. So, yeah, I think we owe you as well. So, thanks a lot
Okay,
for sharing this experiences and thoughts. And yeah,
okay.
it's very inspiring. It's such an honor to have you. Thanks a lot. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you for offering to have me, and I'm very much enjoying the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.